Dallas. 6:47 in the morning. The terminal stretches wide and gray under fluorescent light. Hundreds of people moving in every direction, rolling luggage, paper cups. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday that has no idea what it's about to become. Cruel back to gate C14. A man sits alone in a plastic chair, flannel shirt, canvas bag worn at one corner. A newspaper, actual paper, folded across his knee. He isn't watching the gate, he isn't checking his phone, he's just sitting, still. The way people sit when they know exactly where they are and exactly what they're doing there. Nobody looks at him twice. Cut to a woman moving through the first-class cabin of a waiting aircraft. Expensive dress, precise stride. The walk of someone who has never once adjusted herself to a room. She glances at the seat beside hers and stops. Something shifts in her face, something that will cost her everything. Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, Gate C14, 6:47 a.m. Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, 6:47 in the morning. The kind of hour that doesn't belong to anyone in particular. Janitors pushing carts through empty corridors. Red-eye passengers still carrying yesterday on their faces. Business travelers who've done this so many times. The airport exists for them the way furniture exists. Necessary, invisible, unremarkable. James Whitfield sat in a plastic chair at gate C14 and looked like he belonged to none of those categories, and all of them at once. 58 years old. Flannel shirt, blue, faded at both elbows, in the specific way that happens from years of resting arms, on desks and tables and car doors, not from any deliberate distressing. Canvas travel bag on the floor beside his feet, worn at the right bottom corner where it always hit the ground. Coffee from the vending machine near the restrooms, the kind that came out too hot and tasted like it had been waiting for someone to make a worse choice. He drank it anyway. Nobody looked at him twice. Not the gate agent sorting boarding passes. Not the young couple arguing quietly over which of them had packed the wrong charger. Not the businessman in the row across from him who was on his third phone call since James had sat down. That was the point. That had always been the point. His phone lay face up on his knee. One message, sent at 6:31 a.m. from Delphion Hurst, stills complete. You need to read it before the board meeting, James. Read it. He'd read the message 3 times, not the file. The message itself. The way she'd written his name like that. Not at the beginning of a sentence where it would make grammatical sense, but dropped in the middle like a weight, like a hand onto shoulder. Like someone who had spent 17 years working alongside a person and had learned exactly when that person needed to be called by name instead of title. Delphine only wrote like that when something was worse than she'd expected, and Delphine expected a lot. He picked up the coffee, took a sip, looked out at the gate area. Gate C14 was filling the way airports fill in the early morning, gradually, without ceremony. A young mother, negotiating a collapsible stroller with one hand while keeping a grip on a toddler's wrist with the other, both of them losing the battle on separate fronts. 2 men in matching rolling luggage sets, talking at each other with the particular rhythm of people who'd been having the same conversation for years and had stopped requiring responses. A teenager horizontal across 3 chairs, headphones on, completely unconscious, using the airport as a bed. The way only the young and the unbothered can. Normal morning, normal gate. Normal collection of people going somewhere. James watched all of them. He typed back, "I'll read it on the plane." The response came in 11 seconds, which told him she was already at her desk. Which meant she'd been at her desk since before 6. Which meant she hadn't slept, or had slept the 3 hours that Delphine called sleeping when she was in the middle of something. Don't wait too long. He set the phone down, reached into the outside pocket of his canvas bag and pulled out a newspaper. The actual paper kind. Broadsheet, folded in quarters, with ink that still came off slightly on your fingers if the morning was humid. The kind of object that made younger people do a small double take, like they'd spotted something from a museum exhibit, walking around in public. James liked that look. He'd been getting it for years. He intended to keep getting it. He opened to the front page and started reading. Gate C14 kept filling around him. The gate agent made an announcement about overhead bin space. The toddler started crying about something, and then stopped. The businessman finished his third call, and immediately started a fourth. James read the paper, and thought about his father. There was a specific reason he still bought newspapers from airport kiosks, and it had nothing to do with staying informed, and everything to do with a kitchen table in Southwest Atlanta, and a man named Robert Whitfield, who had understood something about the world that most people never figured out. Robert Whitfield had been a mechanic for a decade and a bus driver for 31 years after that. He'd gotten to work at 6 every morning of his working life and left at 5 every evening, and he had never once complained about either of those facts. He'd raised his son in a house where the coffee was ready before 6, and the newspaper was on the table by 6:15, and every Sunday morning he would sit down with both and read the entire paper front to back. Every section. The obituaries, the letters to the editor, the weather report. James had asked him once. He was 9 years old, sitting across the table, eating cereal, why he bothered reading the weather for cities like Portland and Milwaukee and Seattle when they lived in Georgia and had no plans to go anywhere. Robert looked up over the top of the page. He had the kind of face that didn't change expression quickly. Everything he felt moved through something first, got considered, and then arrived on his face as something measured and intentional. Because the world is bigger than what you can see from your own window, son, he said. And a man who only knows his own weather doesn't know much at all. James was 9 years old. He never forgot it. He was 12 the day the other thing happened. The thing that took him longer to understand, not because it was more complicated, but because understanding it required living long enough to see it from the right angle. Friday afternoon in September. The garage smelling the way it always smelled at the end of a long week. Oil and metal, and the particular exhaustion of work, done right repeatedly, without acknowledgement. A man pulled in driving a white Cadillac. Brand new, brilliant white in the September afternoon light. The kind of car that made a statement before the door opened. The man who got out was wearing a sport coat over an open-collar shirt and a watch that caught the sun when he moved his wrist, and the expression of someone who had decided at some point that the world arranged itself around him, not the other way around. He had a leak in his coolant line. Robert diagnosed it in 5 minutes and fixed it in 40, the way he fixed everything, thorough, precise, without shortcuts. When he was done, he wrote up the invoice and handed it over. The man looked at the invoice. Then he looked at Robert and said something. One word. James was standing in the doorway of the waiting room. He heard it. The word landed in the air of the garage like something solid, something with edges, and it just stayed there, the way certain things stay in certain spaces long after the person who put them there has gone. He watched his father's face. Nothing changed. That was the thing. That was the thing James spent the next 46 years turning over, examining from different angles, trying to fully comprehend. Not the word. The word he understood in the moment, viscerally, in his stomach before his brain had finished processing it. What he didn't understand, what took him years, and then decades, was his father's face. Nothing changed in it. Not a muscle shifted, not a breath altered. Robert Whitfield took the invoice back from the man's hand, wrote out a receipt, held out the car keys and said, "Drive safe now, sir." The man took the keys and left. The white Cadillac backed out of the bay and pulled away down the street and disappeared around the corner. James walked out of the doorway and stood next to his father. He didn't know what to say, so he asked the only question that was fully formed. "Why didn't you say anything?" Robert was quiet for a moment, wiping his hands on the shop rag the way he always did after a job. Slow, methodical, each finger, both palms, not stalling. Thinking. People see what they want to see, son. he said finally. "You can't change their eyes by arguing with them. The only thing you can change is the world they're looking at, and you do that by how you live, not by what you say." James was 12 years old. He built a Fortune 500 company on that sentence. Not immediately, not easily, not without the particular cost that comes from spending your life proving something to people who weren't paying attention in the first place. But the sentence was the foundation. The thing he came back to when the building got hard, when the work got difficult, when the room he was walking into had already decided what it thought about him before he opened the door. He didn't argue with rooms. He changed what they were looking at. The gate agent's voice came over the intercom. "Flight 1184, Dallas to New York. Non-stop, departing 8:15. Now boarding priority passengers." James folded his newspaper, tucked it under his arm, picked up his canvas bag, worn at the right bottom corner, same corner it had always been worn at, and stood. He was the third person through the gate, not because he was in a hurry, because he wanted to be in his seat before she got on. Flight 1184, first-class cabin, 8:02 a.m. This part requires explanation. 3 weeks earlier, James had called Delphine at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday and said 4 words: "Pull the personnel files." Not a legal brief, not a regulatory filing, not the kind of document that gets reviewed before board meetings and shareholder calls. The actual files, the ones that HR keeps on individual employees, the ones that contain the performance reviews and the internal complaints and the carefully worded termination letters that say everything except what actually happened. Delphine had spent a week pulling them, 34 files, all terminations, all from the operations division of Westbridge International, all occurring within a 4-year window. She'd organized them chronologically, cross-referenced by department, and sent them over in a package that James read on a Sunday afternoon in 3 hours, stopping twice. 34 employees terminated under the direct supervision of Diana Harlow, Chief Operating Officer of Westbridge. 26 of them were women, people of color, or both. The pattern was visible even before analysis. Numbers had a way of showing you things that individual events could disguise. A single termination had a reason: poor performance, restructuring, conduct issues. 10 terminations had explanations. 26 out of 34 was a different kind of mathematics. James had called Delphine back that Sunday evening. "Kind me the stories behind these numbers," he said. "The people. What actually happened." Delphine called back 4 days later. She'd found several, but one file she kept coming back to: Simone Garrett, 44 years old at present, terminated 3 years ago, after 11 years with Westbridge. Her performance reviews, going back 7 years, read like a textbook case of a person doing everything right, exceptional instincts, consistently above standard results, strong leadership presence, demonstrates initiative without being asked. 7 years of that language, from multiple supervisors, consistent across departments. Then a promotion nomination, regional director, operations division. The first time a black woman had ever been nominated for that role in the company's history. Nomination withdrawn. No official explanation filed. 2 weeks after the withdrawal, Simone filed an internal complaint, acknowledged by HR with a case number and a form email. Then silence. 6 months after the complaint, terminated. Reason: attitude not aligned with company culture and repeated failure to meet performance benchmarks. The same supervisor, who had written exceptional instincts in 5 consecutive annual reviews, signed the termination paperwork. James had read that detail and set the file down and looked at the ceiling for a while. After reading everything, he'd asked Delphine one question: "What's Diana Harlow's travel schedule this month?" Delphine answered without asking why. She'd learned over 17 years which questions were strategic and which were rhetorical and which needed no explanation at all. This one needed no explanation. Diana Harlow flew New York every 3rd week. Same route always. Dallas to JFK, always the 8:15 morning departure. Always seat 4B in first class. James booked seat 4A the same afternoon, not to confront her. He had attorneys and investigators, and a board meeting scheduled for the following week, and those were the instruments for confrontation. He booked the seat because 200 pages of documentation had told him what Diana Harlow did, in numbers and dates and carefully constructed paper trails. And he needed to understand what she was. There's a difference between those two things. He'd learned that from his father, too. The first-class cabin on Flight 1184 held 12 seats, 6 rows of 2, leather, the particular quietness that comes from soundproofing, and the absence of the noise that fills every other part of a commercial aircraft. James settled into 4A, window side. Put his bag under the seat in front, not in the overhead bin. He didn't need the extra room. And unfolded his newspaper, ordered coffee when the flight attendant came through. Then he waited. Rosa Vega had worked the Dallas to New York route for 9 of her 14 years with the airline. 52 years old, hair pulled back, silver at the temples. The kind of professional calm that doesn't come from temperament but from accumulated experience. From having handled medical emergencies and unruly passengers in turbulence, bad enough to send unsecured items into the ceiling, and having done all of those things without losing the thread of the job, which was to keep people safe, and to make them feel, when possible, that being 30,000 feet in the air was a reasonable and comfortable thing to be doing. She noticed Diana Harlow come through the cabin door at 7:58 a.m. Not from the clothes, though the clothes were expensive. Not from the bag, though the bag announced itself. From the walk, there was a specific quality to the way Diana Harlow moved through the cabin. Not rushed, not aggressive, nothing you could point to and define. Just a walk that treated the space as already belonging to her, that didn't adjust for the presence of other people, that moved through the world the way water moves through the path of least resistance, not because it's flexible, but because it assumes everything will yield. Rosa had worked in service long enough to recognize that walk on sight. She'd learned to pay close attention when she saw it. Deanna moved down the aisle counting rows. 2, 3, 4. She looked at 4B. Then, following normal instinct at the seat beside it, she saw James, and she stopped. What happened next happened in less than 2 seconds. This is the part that gets softened in retellings, smoothed over in the polite language people reach for when they're trying to describe something that makes them uncomfortable to name directly. But the truth of it was simple and blunt. Diana Harlow looked at a black man sitting quietly in a first-class seat, in a flannel shirt, with a newspaper on his knee and a cup of coffee, and something in her brain ran a calculation that she wasn't aware she was running. She wasn't aware. That was the whole problem. That had always been the whole problem. Excuse me. James looked up from the newspaper. No, Diana said, just the one word, flat, absolute. The tone of someone stating a fact about the nature of reality. James looked at her, then at his boarding pass, then back at her with the particular patience of a man who has made a decision in advance about how he is going to conduct himself when this happens. Because he'd known at some point in his life that he would need to make that decision before the moment arrived, because the moment always arrived. I have seat 4A, ma'am. I don't care what you have. Rosa was at the front of the cabin when she heard not the words yet, just the tone, the specific frequency of a situation going wrong. 14 years of that job had given her something close to a sixth sense for it, the way certain animals can detect changes in barometric pressure before a storm. She walked down. Is there a problem? Yes, Diana said, and the word came out with the relief of someone who had been waiting for an authority to address. There is a problem. I am not sitting next to this man. Rosa looked at James's boarding pass. Seat 4A, valid. Properly issued, ma'am. This gentleman's seat assignment is correct. I understand what his assignment says. I'm telling you, I won't be using mine while he's in that one. The cabin had gone quiet. Not the deliberate silence of attention, but the involuntary silence of people who have stopped what they were doing because something is demanding to be noticed. Conversations suspended mid-sentence, the sounds of settling in, rustling, overhead bins, the clink of ice in someone's drink, all of it suspended. James set his newspaper on his knee, folded it along the crease, placed it flat. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Diana Harlow with an expression that Rosa, describing it later, would reach for the word recognition to name. Not surprise, not confusion. The expression of a man who had encountered this before, in different rooms and different contexts, but with the same essential architecture, and had long since decided exactly how he'd respond when it came for him again. "Ma'am," he said, the voice quiet, not soft. There was nothing soft about it, but contained, like something with a great deal of pressure behind it and a choice to apply none of it. "I'm not going to move. This is my seat." 4 words. The last 3 of them. And somehow, precisely because they were so simple, they were the thing that broke the situation open. Diana Harlow's composure shifted. It didn't crack. Diana Harlow had spent 18 years in corporate environments that rewarded composure, and she wasn't going to lose it over a man in a flannel shirt. But the pitch changed. The volume went up. And the things she said in the next 3 minutes were the kinds of things that she believed she was keeping quiet. She was not keeping them quiet. Someone like him doesn't belong up here. I paid for this seat. I pay for these flights every month, and I am a loyal customer, and I am telling you, look at that bag. Look at that shirt. There has clearly been some kind of error in how the upgrade process works. Each sentence landing in the silent cabin like something dropped from a height. Each one a little harder, a little more declarative, a little more certain of its own authority. Rosa stood between them. Professionally, carefully. The way you stand when you're trying to hold a space steady without taking a side, because the job doesn't give you the luxury of sides, ma'am. I need to ask you to lower your voice. I will not lower my voice. I want this resolved. I understand your concern, and either he moves or I'm filing a formal complaint against this crew and this airline. Starting with you. People in other rows were no longer pretending not to listen. They'd given up on the pretense and were simply watching. The way you watch something that has gotten beyond the point where watching it is comfortable, but not yet to the point where you can look away. Then Diana Harlow raised her right hand, extended her middle finger, held it approximately 3 inches from James Whitfield's face. The cabin went still in a way that was different from the quiet of a moment ago. This was the stillness of collective shock. The kind that happens when something crosses a line so visibly, so undeniably, that even the air in the room seems to stop moving. James looked at the finger. Then he looked at Diana Harlow's eyes, and he smiled, not the smile of triumph, not the smile of contempt. Something quieter and more complicated than either of those. Something that arrived on his face the way things arrive when they've traveled a long distance to get there. The smile of a man who had just watched 200 pages of documentation stand up and look him in the face. Confirmation. Complete. Undeniable. Diana lowered her hand. She did it before she'd made the conscious decision to do it. The smile had done something to the certainty she'd walked onto the plane with. Made it feel less certain. Made it feel for the first time like something that could be questioned. She didn't know why. She wouldn't understand why for a long time. Rosa stepped forward, calms positioning herself in the aisle, with the practiced authority of someone who has ended difficult situations by changing the geometry of them, ma'am. I'm going to need you to take your seat. Then she turned to James. Her voice shifted, not dramatically, not with any performance of sympathy, just the genuine modulation of someone who is separating one conversation from another. Sir, I sincerely apologize for this situation. We have seating available in our forward section. More space, quieter. I'd like to offer it to you. James looked at her for a moment. At the steadiness in her face, at the apology in it that was real, not performed. He nodded. He stood, picked up his bag, his newspaper, his coffee, still warm. And as he stepped into the aisle, Rosa fell into step beside him, and at the last moment, in the narrow space between the seat rows, passing Diana. Rosa leaned slightly in Diana's direction, said something, 12 words. Quiet enough that no one seated nearby could make them out. Quiet enough that only Diana heard. Diana's face changed, not the way faces change from cruelty, the way they change from truth. The kind of truth that bypasses the ears and goes somewhere deeper and lands there and sits. Rosa straightened, walked forward with James. Did not look back. Diana stood alone in the space beside her seat. Around her, the cabin remained very carefully occupied with other things. Phones, windows, the fabric of the seat back, calloused palms, anything, except the woman standing in the aisle. She sat down, picked up her drink from the tray. The flight attendant had already placed there, looked at it, put it down, didn't pick it up again, for the rest of the flight. Flight 1184, forward, cabin and seat, 11A, cruising, altitude. The forward cabin had 2 seats and a bulkhead, and the particular atmosphere of a space where people paid extra for privacy. James settled into the window seat, put his bag down, and spread the newspaper on his knee. He wasn't reading it. The coffee had gone lukewarm. He drank it anyway. Outside, the tarmac was still visible. They hadn't pushed back yet. A fuel truck moved in a slow arc around the wing. A ground crew member, in a high-visibility vest, walked with the specific purposefulness of someone who knows exactly what they're walking toward, and doesn't need to look around to confirm it. Normal people. Normal work. Normal morning, his phone buzzed. Delphine. You boarded? He typed back, yes. Write the file, all of it. He looked at the message for a moment. Then he put the phone away and looked out the window. He already knew more of the file than Delphine realized. He'd been reading it for 3 weeks. But there was something she'd found the night before, something in the archived records, a document she'd mentioned in a brief call that she hadn't been able to explain fully over the phone. Something that predated Diana Harlow's time in the operations division. Something older, she'd said. The problem isn't just Diana. The problem is architectural. He'd asked what she meant. She'd said, read the rest. Then I'll explain. He'd read what she'd sent. And he understood enough to understand he didn't understand all of it yet. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engines built. Dallas fell away beneath them. James opened the newspaper and started reading from the front. In row 11, Warren Lyle had been in his window seat since before the boarding door opened. 46 years old. Cybersecurity attorney, with a practice that occupied a narrow technical space most people couldn't describe without glazing over. Digital forensics, evidence chain authentication, corporate data liability. He worked for plaintiffs mostly. People who had been harmed by institutions and needed someone to prove it in language that courts would accept. He preferred being underestimated. It was professionally useful. When the incident happened in row 4, Warren registered it the way he registered most things in public spaces. Completely, without reaction, without leaning forward or adjusting his posture, or doing any of the things that signal attention. He simply absorbed it. His phone was already in his hand, not pointed at the scene. That would have been conspicuous. And conspicuous was the opposite of useful. But positioned and recording, he'd started the backup. Before Diana Harlow finished her second sentence, not because he knew who either of the people involved were. He didn't. Not because he'd recognized anyone or understood the specific context. He hadn't. Because 15 years of working in the aftermath of institutional misconduct had given him a very finely calibrated instinct for a specific type of moment. The moment when someone with money and access makes a public mistake and then goes very quiet very quickly. The moment when expressions shift from anger to calculation. The moment the situation stops being about the thing that just happened and starts being about the management of the thing that just happened. Warren had watched that transition happen in real time, in Diana Harlow's face, in the space after James Whitfield's smile and before she lowered her hand. He recognized it immediately. 3 separate backup servers, each in a different state. Full audio. Clean video from 2 angles. Metadata intact. Timestamp to the second. Chain of custody established and documented. He finished the backup before they reached 10,000 feet. Just in case. By cruising altitude, he'd opened a brief on his laptop and was doing the work he'd come on this flight to do. He didn't think about the incident in row 4 again until they landed. The flight took 3 hours and 14 minutes. James read the newspaper cover to cover, including the weather section. Portland was expecting rain on Thursday. Milwaukee was clear through the weekend. He read both forecasts carefully, the way his father had taught him to read things that seemed like they weren't about him. They were always about something. JFK Airport. Baggage claim. Karos 3:14 p.m. The baggage claim at JFK had the particular quality of an airport space where everyone was simultaneously arriving and already somewhere else in their minds. Bags circling, people tracking their phones, and the carousel simultaneously. The specific ambient noise of several hundred people who have been sitting for hours and are now required to stand. Warren Lyle positioned himself near Carousel 4 at 3:09 p.m. His own bag was a carry-on. He traveled light, a professional discipline. So he was there for no functional reason, except that he'd noticed Diana Harlow was there, and his instinct said to wait. She was 5 feet away, phone pressed against her ear, voice low. Not low enough, Frank. We have a problem. The man on the plane. I need you to find out who he is. Tonight, a pause. She was listening. I don't know how bad the video is. I need you to find out before I do. Another pause longer. Her expression shifted. The calculation Warren had seen at 30,000 feet was back. More developed now. Okay. Nothing on this line. Lexington entrance. I'll be there in 40. She hung up. Looked at her phone. Looked at the carousel. Looked at something only she could see. Warren looked at his phone. He pressed record. He didn't know what he'd captured at the gate. He didn't know yet whether Diana Harlow was a person of consequence, or just someone who'd behaved badly on a Tuesday morning. He didn't know who Frank was, or what Lexington entrance meant, or what the problem actually was. But he knew the voice of someone managing a situation rather than responding to one. And he knew that audio, if it turned out to matter, was only useful if it existed. He let it run. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Then she moved away from the carousel and toward the exit, and he stopped the recording and transferred it to the same servers where the flight footage lived. He retrieved his carry-on from a colleague who'd checked it for him and walked out of baggage claim into the gray New York afternoon. He thought about the man in seat 4A, the patience in his face, the smile. He thought about the woman on the phone, the calculation. He thought about 15 years of working in the space where those two things met. Then he got into a cab and went to his office, Manhattan. James's hotel room. Evening, the hotel was on the east side, not far from Midtown, the kind of place that was clean and functional and completely anonymous. James had chosen it specifically for those qualities. He didn't need a view, or a concierge or a restaurant with a tasting menu. He needed a desk, a working lamp, and a door that closed. He sat at the desk as the city outside the window went through its evening transition, the shift from late afternoon gray to the particular amber of Manhattan at dusk. When the buildings start holding the light from inside instead of Iowa flyer from outside. Delphine had called twice. He'd answered the second time. She walked him through it. The video had cleared 400,000 views by 3 in the afternoon, climbing. The clip of Diana's hand, the middle finger. The 3 inches had separated from the longer footage and was circulating independently with the kind of velocity that meant it would be in the mainstream news cycle by morning. She told him what Frank Mercer had done in the first 6 hours. Frank Mercer, CEO of Westbridge International for 19 years. The name had been throughout the files Delphine assembled, but always in the background, the organizational chart, the signature lines on policy documents. the recipient line on internal memos. The person at the top of the structure that had produced the pattern of 34 terminations. In the 6 hours since the video started spreading, Frank had made calls. Delphine's contact at the company had tracked 4 of them, one to a financial journalist with a history of running corporate-friendly narratives, one to the company's communications director, one to outside counsel, and one to someone whose connection to Westbridge wasn't documented anywhere she could find, which meant the connection had been deliberately kept off the books. The result of those 4 calls was already visible. A piece on a financial blog, posted at midnight, questioned James Whitfield's stability of jest, judgment, and fitness for executive leadership, following what it called a personal altercation on a commercial flight. The phrase appeared 4 times in the piece, the word that was used instead of what actually happened. Personal altercation. Like James had been the one in the aisle, like he'd been the one who raised his hand, and Rosa Vega had been suspended at 11:47 p.m. via email. After 14 years of service, a perfect conduct record, and no formal complaints in the entirety of her career with the airline. An email, sent by someone in HR whose name Delphine couldn't locate in the company's public directory, informing her that she was suspended pending investigation into violations of passenger privacy policy. James listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he looked at his coffee. The same vending machine, variety from this morning, now stone cold, still in the paper cup, sitting at the edge of the desk like evidence of something. Delphine. Yes, I need to meet with Simone Garrett. Can you arrange it? A pause. Not hesitation. Delphine didn't hesitate, not professionally. The pause of someone calculating logistics. Tomorrow morning. I'll make the call tonight, thank you. He set the phone down, picked up the newspaper. The one from this morning, still folded to the weather section. He hadn't finished it on the plane. He'd gotten to Portland and Milwaukee. And then the aircraft had started its descent, and he'd put it away. He found the place where he'd left off. Read the rest of the weather forecasts. Cities he'd never visited, cities he might never visit. Cities his read about a kitchen table in Atlanta and considered worth knowing anyway. The world is bigger than what you can see from your own window. He set the paper down and opened his laptop. The file was there. Delphine had reorganized it overnight, added the new material she'd mentioned on the phone, the archived documents, the things that predated Diana Harlow's tenure in the operations division. The thing pointed toward the architecture, rather than just the person operating inside it. He started reading. Diana Harlow had joined Westbridge 18 years ago as a mid-level operations analyst. She'd been competent, by the early records, genuinely productive, quick to understand systems, useful in the way that people who grasp organizational politics are useful because they understand not just how work happens, but who makes it happen and why. She'd identified Frank Mercer within her first year, or, rather, reading between the lines of the documents, they'd identified each other. Frank was the kind of CEO who rose to 19 years by being, above all things, never the most visible person in any controversy. He'd survived 3 recessions and 2 near-merger collapses, and at least 4 waves of corporate leadership philosophy that should have made him obsolete. He survived them by being indispensable to the people above him, and unthreatening to the people beside him, and absolutely dependable to the people he chose to protect. Diana brought results. Frank ensured she rose. And when complaints started appearing, small ones at first, isolated, the kind that could be routed through HR and quietly lost, Frank had a system for that. James scrolled to the section of the file that Delphine had flagged. A series of archived documents, the kind that lived in paper records rather than digital ones, because they predated the company's migration to electronic filing. Delphine had driven to a records facility in New Jersey to access them personally. He read the first one, a memo dated 12 years ago from Frank Mercer's office. Never intended for general circulation, The distribution list had 3 names on it, all of them in HR or legal. Resolution of sensitive employee relations matters. The language was careful, bureaucratic. Precisely the kind of language that is careful and bureaucratic because it's designed to describe something without describing it. But James had spent enough years in conference rooms where careful and bureaucratic language was the currency of power to read through it. What the memo described, in 6 paragraphs and 2 attached appendices, was a system. A process for routing internal complaints in a way that protected the company from exposure, which HR personnel were authorized to reclassify certain types of complaints before they reached formal review, which outside counsel to engage for confidential settlements, how to document performance reviews after the fact in ways that created legal cover for termination decisions that had already been made. Frank Mercer had built this system, not Diana, not the HR personnel who implemented it. Frank. And he'd built it 3 years before Diana Harlow was ever in a position of authority to use it, which meant that what Diana had done, the 34 terminations, the withdrawn nomination, the manufactured performance reviews, the basement office with the flickering light, all of it had been learned behavior, inherited behavior. Behavior modeled by someone who had been doing this longer, at a higher level with more cover. James sat back. He'd come on this flight to understand what Diana Harlow was. And he did, now, more completely than he had 12 hours ago. But she wasn't the origin. She was the latest iteration of something older. He looked at the window. Manhattan was fully dark now, in the way it never gets fully dark. All those windows, all those lights. The city humming along below the 47th floor, with its usual indifference to what was happening in any one room, at any one moment. He thought about Simone Garrett, the box on the table, lid already on it, her things already packed the night. Before she walked in, he thought about the prescription, the one she'd rationed by reducing her own dose, extending 1 month's supply into almost 3, because the termination had taken her insurance effective. The last day of employment and the gap before she could get coverage elsewhere had been longer than anyone planned for. He'd read that in the file and stopped reading for a few minutes. That's what it actually costs. Not the lawsuit costs. Not the reputational damage and the settlement figures that get negotiated between attorneys in conference rooms, the woman at the kitchen table counting what she has left of something she needs. He opened a new document on his laptop and started writing notes. Not legal strategy. That was Delphine's domain, and she was better at it than he would ever be. Something else. The shape of what he understood. The sequence. The accountability structure. Frank had built the architecture. Diana had used it. HR had maintained it. The system had been running for 12 years, and he had owned 68% of it. He sat with that for a while. He wouldn't say I didn't know as though that were a defense. His father had not raised him to reach for defenses when the truth was available, and the truth was simpler and harder. He had not paid attention. He had been running the company the way certain owners run things, at the level of strategy and return, not at the level of the person in the basement office. He had not looked down far enough. He had trusted systems without verifying them. He had accepted performance numbers without asking what it cost the people producing them. He had not paid attention. That was the truth, unadorned. And now he was paying attention. He kept writing. The city burned outside the window. The lamp on the desk threw a circle of light across the papers spread in front of him. Somewhere in this city, Simone Garrett was in an apartment she could barely afford, with her 72-year-old mother who had driven after everything collapsed. Somewhere in this city, Rosa Vega had received an email telling her 14 years was over, sent by someone whose name didn't appear in any directory. Somewhere on the 44th floor of the Westbridge building, Frank Mercer was in his corner office, with his view of 2 sides of Manhattan, running his containment plan, the way he'd run containment plans before. James wrote until 2 in the morning. Then he closed the laptop, picked up the newspaper, read the front page from the beginning. Because the world was bigger than what he could see from his own window, and a man who only knew his own weather didn't know much at all. His father had told him that, in a kitchen in Atlanta, at a table where the coffee was always ready before 6, he sat with that for a long time. Then he put the paper down, turned off the lamp, and in the dark of the hotel room, he made himself a single promise. Tomorrow, when he sat across from Simone Garrett, he was not going to say, "I'm sorry," and mean nothing by it. He was going to say it and mean everything. And then he was going to get to work. Westbridge International, Frank Mercer's office, 44th floor, 3:22 p.m. Day of the flight, Frank Mercer got the call at 3:22 p.m. He was at his desk when it came in. The corner office on the 44th floor, 2 walls of glass, Manhattan on both sides. The kind of view that exists not for the person sitting behind the desk, but for everyone who walks into the room and has to calibrate themselves against it. 19 years of that view. 19 years of watching people walk in and adjust. He listened, didn't speak for 90 seconds, which was longer than most people expected. The first time they called Frank Mercer with a problem, they expected immediate reaction, commands, the decisive CEO voice. What they got instead was silence, and the silence was more unsettling than any command would have been, because it meant he was thinking rather than reacting, and thinking was where Frank Mercer was most dangerous. He said, "Where are you right now?" Diana told him, "Don't talk to anyone. Not a colleague, not a friend, not your driver. Come in through the Lexington entrance. I'll have someone meet you." He hung up, sat very still. 19 years as CEO of Westbridge International. 19 years of navigating the specific terrain of large institutional power. The earnings calls, the board dynamics, the near mergers that would have gutted the company if he hadn't read the room correctly in time. He'd built a reputation for being steady, unflappable. The kind of executive who didn't panic, because panicking cost money and cost time, and, most importantly, showed people something about you that you could never fully take back. He was not panicking now. He was calculating. He picked up his fuss phone, the landline, not the cell, a distinction that mattered in certain conversations, and made 4 calls. The first was to a journalist he'd known for 11 years, who wrote for a financial publication with credibility and an audience of exactly the people Frank needed to reach. He didn't ask for anything directly. He never asked for anything directly. He had described the situation as he was framing it. An owner with a personal grievance, a public incident that said more about instability than injustice, a company that deserved stable leadership, and he let the journalist draw his own conclusions. The journalist had drawn similar conclusions before, when Frank had described situations in similar terms. The relationship worked because they both understood it without ever naming what it was. The second call was to Westbridge's communications director. Brief, specific. A counter-narrative needed to be in circulation before the morning news cycle. The words personal altercation were to be used consistently. The incident was to be characterized as a dispute between passengers, not a pattern of behavior, not representative of anything larger than one difficult morning on a commercial flight. The third call was to outside counsel, the attorney who handled the sensitive matters, the one whose name appeared in a 12-year-old memo that Frank had not thought about in a long time, and was now thinking about in the specific way you think about things you hopes to never need to think about again. The fourth call was to a number on a separate phone. The phone he kept in the right drawer of his desk, turned off except when he needed it. The man on the other end did various things that Frank found occasionally useful and never discussed openly. This time, Frank needed 2 things. Information about a specific former employee named Simone Garrett, where she was, what she was doing, whether she was reachable, and a quiet assessment of what James Whitfield had been doing in the 6 months before this flight. Because Frank had just understood something that changed the shape of the entire situation. James Whitfield had booked seat 4A, not seat 4C or 5A or any of the other available seats on the 8:15 departure. Seat 4A, the seat directly beside Diana's standing reservation of 4B. On a flight Diana took every third week. That was not coincidence, which meant this was not an incident, which meant Frank had not received a phone call about something that happened. He had received a phone call about something that had been set in motion. He ended the fourth call, leaned back in his chair, looked at Manhattan through two walls of glass. He had run containment before, several times, over 19 years. The principle was always the same. Move faster than the story. Define the narrative before the narrative defines you. And most importantly, identify everyone who might complicate things and address them before they became problems. He'd done it well, every time. He intended to do it well now. What Frank Mercer did not know, sitting in his corner office at 3:22 p.m., was that 40 minutes earlier, a man named Warren Lyle had been standing 5 feet from Diana Harlow at a baggage carousel with his phone recording, and that the chain of custody on that recording had already been established, mirrored, and secured across 3 servers in 3 separate states. Frank was moving faster than the story. He just didn't know the story had already been saved. Manhattan, various locations, night into morning, day 2, by midnight. The situation had developed in 3 directions simultaneously. The video had passed 400,000 views and was accelerating. The clip of Diana's hand, the extended finger, 3 inches from James Whitfield's face, had separated from the full footage and was moving independently through the kind of social media velocity that meant it would clear the threshold into mainstream news coverage before dawn. Rosa Vega's phone had received a suspension notice at 11:47 p.m. from an HR address that didn't correspond to any name in the airline's public employee directory. The notice cited violations of passenger privacy policy, 14 years of service. One email, sent at midnight, and the financial blog piece went up at 12:30 a.m. James read it at 1:14. He read it the way he read things he needed to understand rather than react to, completely without skipping, noting the specific language choices. Personal altercation. The phrase appeared 4 times, not confrontation, not incident, not what it actually was. Personal altercation, which implied mutuality, which implied that 2 people had behaved badly rather than one, which implied that the man on the receiving end of the raised finger had somehow participated in his own humiliation. The piece used anonymous sources throughout. The framing was careful in the way that carefully framed things always were. Technically unverifiable, legally defensible, effective at planting exactly the seeds it needed to plant, in exactly the audience it needed to reach. James recognized Frank Mercer's fingerprints in every paragraph, even though Frank Mercer's name appeared nowhere in the piece. He closed the laptop. He was angry. Not the reactive kind. Not the anger that wants to make noise and be seen. The other kind. The kind that had been building since he was 12 years old in a garage in Atlanta and had never fully left him. The weight in the chest that you learned to breathe around because fighting it required more energy than carrying it. The anger of someone who has spent a lifetime watching the same thing happen in different rooms, to different people, and has never quite made peace with the fact that it keeps happening. He sat with it. Then he picked up the newspaper, finished it, the weather section. Portland, rain through Thursday. Milwaukee, clear. Chicago, partly cloudy with a front coming in from the lake. He read all of it. Because reaction was what they wanted. Because reacting, calling someone, posting something, issuing a statement, doing any of the visible things that anger makes you want to do at 1 in the morning, was handing them a second story. And the second story would be easier to spin than the first. The first story had video. The second story would have a man behaving like someone who couldn't to control himself, which was exactly what the piece at 12:30 a.m. had been designed to make him look like. He was not going to give them the second story. He set the paper down and went to sleep at 2 a.m. And in the Westbridge building on the 44th floor, Frank Mercer worked until 4. Deanna Harlow, in her apartment on the Upper East Side, did not sleep at all. She lay in the dark and thought about the smile, the one James Whitfield had given her in the aisle after she lowered her hand. She'd been trying to decode it since the plane landed, and she still couldn't get it right. It hadn't been contempt. She knew what contempt looked like. She'd given it to enough people over the years to recognize it. It hadn't been anger. It hadn't been the smile of someone who knew he'd won something. It was something else. Something that suggested he'd understood something she didn't. That was the part she couldn't let go of. And underneath the smile, she kept coming back to what Rosa Vega had said to her in the aisle. 12 words quiet, not unkind, that Diana hadn't been able to stop hearing since the moment they landed. She knew what Frank was doing. She'd watched him do it before with other situations, other people. She'd been a beneficiary of it more than once. The calls, the narrative, the careful rerouting of accountability. She'd always felt secure inside that system. For the first time since she'd built her career inside it, she wondered what it would feel like to be outside it. Manhattan, Hotel Room 714 Midtown, 9 light a.m., Day 2. The hotel room that James had chosen for this meeting was deliberately unremarkable. Room 714, 7th floor, a desk and 2 chairs, and a window with a view of a brick wall and the side of an HVAC unit that hummed with the persistence of something that has been running for years and intends to keep running. He'd chosen it because a meeting in an anonymous space sent a different signal than a meeting in a boardroom or a law firm. It said, "This is not about power, it's about truth." It said, "I'm not asking you to come to my territory." Delphine was already at the desk when James arrived at 8:45. Leather briefcase, reading glasses, a legal pad with notes on the first 2 pages in her precise, compressed handwriting. 17 years of partnership had given her a specific presence in working situations. She didn't perform productivity, she simply produced, and the room arranged itself around her accordingly. She confirmed at 8:15. Delphine said without looking up, "She'll be here at 9. James sat down, adjusted the chair so he was facing the door rather than the window. They waited. Simone Garrett knocked at 9:01. James had read her file enough times that he'd formed an image, which was always a mistake, because files described outcomes, not people. The person who walked through the door at 9. Zo1 was 44 years old and medium height, and she carried herself with a kind of disciplined bearing that James recognized immediately as something learned rather than innate. The bearing of someone who has practiced over years and in difficult circumstances, taking up exactly the right amount of space, not contracting to make themselves smaller, not expanding to take more than they needed, just the right amount, precisely calibrated. The discipline of someone who has been made to feel that any miscalculation in either direction would be held against them. She wore a gray blazer, dark pants, small pearl earrings that James suspected had come from someone she loved. She was carrying a manila envelope, brown, thick, held close against her left side, not tucked under her arm like something forgotten, but pressed there, the way you carry something you've been keeping safe for a long time. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Miss Garrett, thank you for coming." She looked at him with the specific attention of someone who has learned to calibrate people accurately and quickly, because the cost of miscalibrating has been high. Not suspicious, just precise. Then she crossed the room and sat down. She put the envelope on the table, didn't open it. "Before we start," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Of course. Why did you book seat 4A? The room was very still." Delphine's pen stopped. James looked at the envelope, at her hands folded on top of it, at the expression on her face, which was not soft and not hostile, but something between the two that had its own name. The expression of someone who is asking a real question and needs a real answer, not a diplomatic one. Because 200 pages of documentation Told me what Diana Harlow did, he said, and I needed to understand what she was. She held his answer for a moment, and I understand now. A pause. Then Simone Garrett opened the envelope, 52 pages. Printed. Not photographed, not scanned. Printed. From a printer. Pages that she had held in her hands and organized and kept in a specific place for 3 years. She explained why she'd printed them instead of keeping digital copies. She said it without drama, plainly. There were weeks, in the first year after the termination, when she woke up at 3 in the morning and genuinely couldn't be certain that her own memory of events was accurate, that she hadn't been too sensitive, that the rooms and the silences and the slow, systematic dismantling of everything she'd built hadn't been something she'd misread. The papers made it real. Gave the events a physical existence outside her own mind. She'd kept them so she could prove it to herself. Not to a court, not to a jury. Delphine wrote steadily. James said nothing. Because this was not a moment for saying things. Simone talked for 40 minutes. The way memory talks, not in the clean, sequential order of a prepared statement, but doubling back, catching itself, stopping in unexpected places. 11 years. She'd started at the bottom of the operations division and worked in the way people work, when they genuinely believe the work is what determines the outcome. When the evidence around them hasn't yet accumulated enough weight to suggest otherwise. 7 years of reviews that said exceptional. 7 years of consistently above standard. 7 years of language that, reading it now, still had the power to make her feel both proud and furious simultaneously. Proud because it was true, and furious because it hadn't mattered. The nomination for regional director came in her 8th year. First black woman ever put forward for that role in the operations division. Her manager had told her, with real enthusiasm, that it was a formality, that the numbers were there, that it was hers. 3 days after the nomination was submitted, Diana Harlow called her and Simone stopped. Looked at a point somewhere past James's shoulder. The kind of look that means you're finding the memory rather than accessing it. That it lives somewhere specific and you have to go there to get it. She said she had concerns about my cultural fit with the role. That certain client relationships required a specific kind of presence. That she wanted to make sure I'd be set up for success and not put in a position where I might struggle. She looked back at James. She said all of that like she was doing me a favor. Like she was protecting me. The room absorbed it. When I asked her to explain what she meant by cultural fit, specifically, concretely, she smiled and said she thought I understood. A beat I understood. The complaint went to HR on a Tuesday, acknowledged by Thursday. Case number, form email. Someone will follow up within 10 business days. Nobody followed up. Not in 10 days, not in 20, not ever. At day 32, Simone sent a follow-up. The auto-reply said her case manager was out of office. At day 45, the address bounced, invalid. At day 60, she requested a direct meeting with HR. She was told the department was in the middle of a restructuring. Meetings were paused. 2 weeks after that, she logged into the project management system and found her access had been revoked. No notification, no email. She called IT. IT said it was a system update. She asked her manager. Her manager said to reach out to Diana's office. She reached out. Diana's assistant responded 3 days later to say the inquiry had been noted. 6 weeks after that, her office key stopped working. Building security told her she'd been reassigned to a workspace on the lower level. Lower level. That was how they said it. The reality was a basement room 1 floor below the loading dock, 4 steps from the mailroom. No windows. A fluorescent light in the left corner that flickered irregularly. The kind of flicker that isn't constant enough to report, but is constant enough to notice every time. For 4 months. An HVAC system that operated in 2 modes, blasting cold air at full capacity, or nothing at all. The mail cart went by every 40 minutes. She learned to track the time by it. I kept doing good work, Simone said. For 4 months, I kept submitting reports and meeting deadlines and doing everything exactly as I'd always done it. because I genuinely thought, that eventually someone would look at the numbers and see that there was nothing wrong with my performance, and that whatever was happening would stop. She paused. Numbers don't speak for themselves, she said. I know that now. Numbers say whatever the person holding them decides they say. The termination came on a Thursday. Her manager called her into the HR conference room at 9 a.m. A woman from the legal department was already seated. There was a cardboard box on the table, lid on, her name written on the side in marker. They had packed it the night before. Every personal item, from the basement workspace, her desk photographs, her coffee mug, the small framed copy of a quote she'd kept on her desk since her first year, 11 years of small accumulations, in a cardboard box that someone had packed without her present. Meaning the meeting had been scheduled before she walked in. Meaning the outcome had been decided before she sat down. Meaning there was nothing she could say that would change anything. The termination letter cited repeated failure to meet performance benchmarks and conduct inconsistent with company values. She signed for her final paycheck, walked out, stood on the sidewalk in November, box in her arms, badge already deactivated in her coat pocket. They'd done that remotely, sometime the previous day, without telling her. 41 years old. 11 years. Gone in 6 months once she'd made the mistake of believing the system would protect her. My mother, Simone said, denopped. She looked at the table, at the envelope, at her hands. When she looked back up, something in her face had changed in the specific way that faces change. When something is being held very carefully. My mother is 72. She came to stay with me 8 months after the termination. Not because I asked her, because I needed the help and couldn't ask. She drove down from Baltimore. 14 hours. And she moved into my second bedroom, and she has been there since. She stopped again. I had 11 years of performance reviews in a box under my bed. And my 72-year-old mother was buying groceries because I couldn't cover the full month on what I was making from part-time work. James looked at the table. He had read about the prescription in the file. A medical follow-up documented in the complaint materials Simone had filed. She'd included it as context for the financial harm. Monthly prescription, non-negotiable in its medical necessity. Insurance terminated effective the last day of employment. The gap before she secured new coverage had been 4 months. She'd rationed her supply by reducing her own dosage, extending what she had to cover, what she needed to bridge. He hadn't asked her about it yet. He didn't need to ask. The file had given him facts. Simone had given him what the facts meant. Ms. Garrett, he said. She looked at him. Are you all right? The question sat in the room without ornamentation. Not what do you need, or how can I help, both of which would have been questions about the future, about what came next. This one was just the present moment. Just a person asking another person a real question. Simone was quiet for a long time. No, she said. But I'm better than I was. And I'll be better still, when this stops being something that can happen to the next person. James nodded. Then let's make sure it stops. Manhattan, Hotel Room 714. Evening day. 2 into early morning. Day 3 fiend. Called from the lobby at 7:14 that evening. She came up alone, without her full briefcase. She'd left James with the file materials that afternoon and gone back to her office to work on what she described on the phone as the part I haven't shown you yet. Now she had it. She sat across from James, opened a slim folder, and put 3 documents on the table in front of him. The first 2 he recognized. They were from the personnel archives, things she'd already referenced. The third was different. It was older. The paper had the slightly different weight of documents that predate the standardization of office printing supplies. The typeface was from a word processing system that hadn't been in common use for more than a decade, and at the bottom, on the signature line, was Frank Mercer's signature, handwritten, dated 12 years ago. James had seen the memo referenced in the digital files. Delphine had mentioned it existed. This was the physical document. The original, she laid it flat on the table and let him read it. Resolution of sensitive employee relations matters, 6 paragraphs, 2 appendices. The language was bureaucratic with surgical precision. Every sentence designed to describe a process without naming the purpose of the process. What it described, stripped of that language, was a structured method for making discrimination complaints disappear. Which personnel were authorized to reroute filings? Which counsel to engage for off-record settlements? How to update performance review documentation after a decision had already been made, to create retroactive justification for outcomes that had been chosen for other reasons. Frank Mercer had written this, signed it, distributed it to 3 people in HR and legal, and he had done it 3 years before Diana Harlow was ever promoted to a position where she could use it. She didn't invent the system, Delphine said. Not a question. She inherited it, James said, and she used it skillfully. That doesn't reduce her responsibility. No, James said. It doesn't. He looked at the signature at the bottom of the memo. How long after the flight did Frank know who I was? Same afternoon. He had someone identify you within 2 hours of the video appearing online. My contact at the building confirmed the timeline, and his response since then. Delphine laid 4 more documents on the table. The suspension notice for Rosa Vega. A printout of the financial blog piece, with the 4 instances of personal altercation circled. A draft complaint, not yet filed, but drafted by outside counsel, and clearly in preparation, alleging that James had used his position as majority shareholder to conduct a targeted campaign against employees for personal reasons related to the flight incident. And a records request. Frank had pulled Simone Garrett's personnel file. Submitted the request at 9 p.m. the previous evening. Standard form, but the identity of the requester was visible in the system metadata. James looked at the records request for a long time. He's building a counter-narrative, Delphine said. He'll argue that you engineered this, that the flight wasn't coincidence, which it wasn't, but that's not the point, and that you're using your ownership position to conduct a vendetta against employees who embarrassed you publicly. He'll frame Simone as a disgruntled former employee whose complaint was handled properly through legitimate internal processes. He'll use your deliberate seat booking as evidence of premeditation, and Rosa? Collateral, sacrificed to demonstrate to the airline that cooperating with you has consequences. And to create a second narrative, that the flight attendant who witnessed the incident has been found in violation of passenger privacy, which muddies the credibility of her account. James stood up, walked to the window, looked at Manhattan, all those lit rectangles of other people's evenings spread out below. He thought about the records request, about Frank pulling Simone's file at 9 in the evening, about what that meant for someone who had already been through what Simone had been through and was only now, carefully and at enormous personal cost, beginning to trust that this time might be different. What do we have right now, concretely? Tonight, the documentary record, the memo, the termination pattern across 34 files, your account of the flight. Rosa's account, though her suspension complicates its admissibility without additional support, all of which Frank will attack as either coincidental or retaliatory. Yes, we need the original footage, unedited, with intact metadata. Something that can't be reframed. I'm working on that. I have a contact at the airline who may be able to. Work faster, James said. He's not going to wait at 2 late a.m. The phone on the nightstand rang. James picked it up on the second ring. Simone's voice. Quieter than it had been in the hotel room that morning. Not calm. Somewhere below calm, in the specific register of someone who is holding themselves together with deliberate effort. Someone put something under my door. James waited. A photograph. Of my daughter. Walking to school this morning. Just the photograph. No note, nothing written. Just the picture. The room contracted. He knew exactly what it was. Not a legal threat. Nothing that could be taken to police and explained. Nothing that would survive a report. as anything other than a photograph, delivered to the wrong address. Sorry, mistake. The vocabulary, people with power who are not accustomed to being challenged, designed to say one thing without ever saying it. We know where she goes, we see her, we see you. I can't do this, Simone said. I want to. I want to be the person who can. But she's 12 years old, and she walks to school by herself. And I can't. Her voice broke, just briefly. A controlled break, the kind that's worse than losing control entirely, because you can hear the effort in it. I can't. I'm so sorry. James didn't say we'll protect you. He didn't say you'll be safe. He'd learned a long time ago the difference between what was easy to say and what he could actually guarantee, and he had a rule about not crossing that line. I understand, he said, completely. This number doesn't go dark. Whatever time, whatever changes, you call. Thank you, she said. She hung up. James held the phone. The anger was there, the calcified kind, the permanent resident. But underneath it, something colder and more deliberate was forming, because what had just happened was not a legal maneuver or a PR strategy or a counter-narrative. What had just happened was a 12-year-old girl's school commute had been photographed and slipped under her mother's door to remind her mother what silence was worth. That was Frank Mercer. At 2 in the morning, running his system, James called Delphine. She picked up on the first ring. I know, she said. I have a contact in the building security office. It came from Frank's network. We can't prove it directly yet. Then we move before he moves again. The board meeting is in 4 days. We're not waiting 4 days. What's the date of the annual shareholder gala? A pause. The sound of a calendar being checked day after tomorrow. The Harrington. Grand Ballroom. Frank is going to use it. He'll build his case to the shareholders. Just before I walk into the board meeting, make the removal feel like consensus rather than decision. He wants the optics of it done publicly, in front of the people who matter. That's my read as well. Then we give him his public moment, James said, and we use it. Delphine was quiet for a moment. We still need the footage, without need the footage. Original metadata. Keep working on it. I have a feeling we're going to hear from someone before morning. At 3 late a.m., James didn't sleep. He sat at the desk, with Simone's file open in front of him, not looking for new information. He had all the information, reading it, to stay connected to the weight of it, to keep it from becoming abstract, to keep it from becoming strategy and leverage and fiduciary concern, and all the language powerful people reach for when they want to discuss human harm without fully feeling what it is. The box with the lid. Her badge deactivated before she walked in. The prescription measured out in smaller doses to extend what she had. The 12-year-old girl who walked to school by herself. He read until the city outside started making the specific sounds of very early morning. Garbage trucks on the avenue below, a distant siren, the infrastructure shifting from its nighttime rhythms toward its daytime ones. Then his phone rang, 5:47 a.m. Unknown number. New York area code Mr. Whitfield, the voice of someone who had already decided to make this call before dialing. Speaking, my name is Warren Lyle. I don't think we've been formally introduced. I was in row 11 on your flight yesterday morning. James sat up straighter. I know who you are, he said. You're the one who backed everything up. A pause. You noticed I notice most things. Then I'll skip the explanation of who I am and tell you what I have. Manhattan Hotel Room 714, 5:47 a.m. In day 3, Warren Lyle talked for 8 minutes. James listened without interrupting once. 3 separate servers, geographically distributed across 3 states. Full audio and video from 2 angles captured during the incident. At row 4, with clean metadata, time-stamped to the second from the moment Diana Harlow stepped into the aisle. Chain of custody established from the moment of recording. Documented and maintained according to federal digital evidence preservation standards. That was the first thing. The second thing. Audio from baggage claim at Dallas-Fort Worth. Diana's call to Frank. 11 minutes and 40 seconds of recording. both sides of the conversation audible and transcribable, including a specific instruction in Frank Mercer's voice that Warren recited from memory without pause. Handle Simone directly. Make sure she understands what continuing forward will cost her. Frank's response to himself, after Diana confirmed she understood. I'll take care of it. The voice of a man for whom this kind of instruction was routine, not rushed, not lowered. Ordinary. James was quiet for a moment after Warren finished. Mr. Lyle, why are you calling me? Because I spent 15 years watching institutions use their resources to bury what they'd done to the people inside them. And I reached the point where I was tired of being a professional witness to it. And the other reason, I'm a cybersecurity attorney. I know what you're going to need to make this case bulletproof. I know how to hold evidence so it can't be challenged. I'm offering those services. Without a fee, James looked at the window. The city outside was just beginning to lighten. Not sunrise, not yet, but the first suggestion of it. The dark, becoming willing to admit that something else was coming. There's one more thing, Warren said. Tell me, last year I worked a labor case. Plaintiff was a former Westbridge employee. The matter settled before trial. During the discovery process, I came across an internal document. I retained a copy because something about it suggested it might have relevance beyond that case. I wasn't certain. I kept it anyway, and now I know exactly why I kept it. He described the document. Frank Mercer's signature, 12 years ago. A memo detailing in the specific bureaucratic language of someone who had thought carefully about how to say something without saying it, the precise mechanics of a system for managing internal complaints. In ways that protected the institution, rather than the people making the complaints. James already knew about the memo. Delphine had found it in the physical archives the previous evening. But Warren's copy was different. It had come through a legal discovery process. It had a provenance, a case number, a court record, a moment in which it had been authenticated as a document that existed and had been produced under oath, which meant it carried a weight that an archival find alone could be challenged on. 2 copies of the same document, from 2 different sources through 2 different channels, neither one dismissible on its own. Together, not dismissible at all. When can you come here? Give me an address. I'll be there in an hour. Warren Lyle arrived at room 714 at 7:15. He was 46 years old, compact in the way that people are compact when they move through the world efficiently, without surplus. Dark jacket. Carry-on bag over one shoulder. He sat down across from James and Delphine and placed 3 items on the table with the care of someone who understood exactly what they were carrying. A sealed external drive in a protective case, a printed document in a clear sleeve, a USB drive in a labeled evidence bag. He walked them through each item. The sealed drive contained the flight footage and the baggage claim audio, along with the documentation of the backup process itself, server addresses, timestamps, transfer logs. The printed document was his copy of the Frank Mercer memo, with its discovery provenance annotated on a cover sheet. The USB contained authentication certificates and chain of custody records. Delphine asked questions, precise technical language of someone who needed the answers to hold up in a proceeding. Warren answered with the patience of someone who had explained these things in legal context before and knew how to make them clear without making them simple. James watched Warren's hands while he talked. The way he handled the sealed drive, not carelessly, not with excessive ceremony, but with the specific attention of someone who understood that the object mattered. The way he laid the printed memo flat rather than folding it. The way he'd organized everything, not for speed, not for impression, but for durability. For the long run. For the version of events that would need to exist not just today, but months from now, in a room with a different kind of audience. This was a man who understood that truth needed to be held correctly if it was going to survive being contested. When Warren finished, Delphine sat back, took off her reading glasses, set them on the table. This is enough, she said. Not emphatic, just certain. The way she said things when she had stopped wondering and started knowing. James looked at the sealed drive, at the memo, at the window. He's going to spend the next 48 hours finishing what he started. Rosa, Simone, the board. He's going to move hard and fast and try to have the situation defined before we can redefine it. Yes, Delphine said. The gala is tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. Grand ballroom. He's planned this for weeks. The annual gala. The shareholder address? The public stage. He's going to use it to build consensus for a leadership transition before I walk into the board meeting the following day. Make it look like the room decided, not the individual. Warren was watching him. You want to take the stage he built. I want to use the audience he assembled. He'll have home advantage. He knows that room, those people. He knows what he thinks they want to hear, James said. That's different from knowing what they'll do when they hear something else. That evening, at 8 o'clock, James called Simone Garrett. She picked up on the third ring. I told you I can't, she said. The same depleted patience from the night before. I know. I'm not calling to ask you to change your mind. Then why? He took a breath. Because I want you to know the truth of where we stand before tomorrow. We have Warren Lyle's footage with full metadata. We have the audio from baggage claim. We have Frank's memo, authenticated through legal discovery and through our own archival find. 2 separate copies, 2 separate chains of custody. Delphine has the 34 files with the statistical pattern. We can walk into that room tomorrow with everything we need to make the case. Okay, without you, he said. We don't need your testimony to establish what happened. The evidence does that on its own. A longer silence. But Simone, he stopped. Start it again. Evidence proves that something happened. It proves facts, dates, documents, actions. But evidence is a document, a timestamp, a record. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't sit across from 400 people and make them feel the weight of what the documents actually meant to the person inside them. He stopped. You're not a document. You're what the document means. And those are completely different things. The silence was long. The kind that means someone is sitting with something real, turning it in their hands. My father, Simone said, and her voice was different. Quieter, but not diminished. 31 years driving the same city bus route. People used to ask him how he did it. Same street, same schedule, every day. He said the hardest part was never the repetition. The hardest part was keeping the schedule when everything else was running late. When the world was doing everything it could to make the route impossible. He said, you drive the route anyway, because people are counting on you to show up. Not sometimes. Not when it's convenient. Always. James was very still. I'll be there, Simone said. After she hung up, James set the phone on the desk. He looked at the sealed drive, at the memo in its clear sleeve, at the window, Manhattan burning its usual program against the dark. He did not call Simone again that night. She had said what she needed to say. He had heard it. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't diminish what had already passed between them. He picked up the newspaper. Read it, from the front page through to the back. Not the weather section this time. He'd read that already, twice today. And some rituals worked precisely because they weren't overused. He read the business section, and the international news, and a long piece about infrastructure in the Midwest that had nothing to do with anything he was currently dealing with. was therefore exactly what he needed. He read until midnight. Then he closed the paper, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about nothing in particular, which was the way he thought when he needed to let everything settle into its actual shape. Manhattan, Hotel Room 714, 4 a.m., day of the gala. The city outside was doing what cities do in the hours before dawn, not sleeping, shifting. The garbage trucks on the avenue below working through their routes with the unhurried certainty of things that run on their own schedule. A delivery van, idle else is happening, idling, at the curb. The specific low register of infrastructure that never fully stops. The hum of it, under everything. The sound of a city that has been running continuously for so long that stopping is no longer something it knows how to do. James was at the desk. He'd been there since 1 a.m. when the newspaper had run out and the file had been read as many times as reading it again help, and what was left was just the waiting. The specific kind of waiting that precedes something you've prepared for, as thoroughly as you know how and cannot prepare for further. 2 cups of coffee on the desk, both cold. He'd stopped noticing them. The sealed drive in its case, Delphine's files, Warren's USB, everything present, everything where it needed to be. He was not anxious, he was not calm, exactly. He was in the particular state that comes after anxiety and before action. A kind of clarified stillness, like the air after rain, everything accounted for, everything as ready as it was going to be. He picked up the phone, not to make a call. Just held it for a moment, thinking about Simone Garrett. She had said, "I'll be there 8 hours ago," and he believed her, and he was not going to call her again to check. That wasn't what she needed, and it wasn't what he needed. She had made her decision, with full understanding of what it cost. The way her father had driven the same route every day, knowing the route was hard, and calling her at 4 in the morning to ask if she still meant. It would be the act of someone who didn't trust what she'd said. He trusted what she'd said. He set the phone down. Instead, he thought about Rosa Vega. About what Delphine had told him 2 days ago, that the airline had received Warren's documentation through their legal department, and someone in their general counsel's office had made a quiet, internal decision. The suspension had been lifted 46 hours after it was issued. No announcement, no apology yet, just the reversal, the specific action of an institution that has realized it has made a legally indefensible move and is backing away from it before it becomes a larger problem. Rosa had called Delphine when she received the notification. Delphine said she'd been quiet for a moment and then asked, "What do I do now?" Delphine had told her, "Whatever you want to do. But if you want to be in that room tonight, James would be glad to have you there." Rosa had said, "I'll be there." 2 women, same words, different roads to them. James looked at the window. The brick wall outside was just barely visible. The dark admitting, reluctantly, the first intimation of something that wasn't dark coming eventually. He thought about what tonight was, not a victory. He'd been careful about that word in his own mind. Tonight was an accounting, an accurate telling of what had happened, delivered in a room where the people who needed to hear it had assembled. Whether that produced the outcomes it needed to produce depended on things he could influence but not control. The responses of 400 people, the integrity of the board, the willingness of the legal system to follow its own standards. He'd done everything he could do. He thought about his father. Not the garage this time. The kitchen table. Sunday morning. The newspaper spread out. The coffee. The weather for cities in other states. The world is bigger than what you can see from your own window. He'd been carrying that for 46 years. Tonight he was going to walk into a room that Frank Mercer had spent weeks preparing for his own purpose. And he was going to stand in it in the same flannel shirt he'd worn since Tuesday, and he was going to show 400 people a world they hadn't been looking at, not because it would fix everything, because it was true. And truth, offered clearly and without performance, had a weight to it that Frank Mercer's careful language could not match. Not because truth always won, but because, in rooms full of people who had not yet decided what they believed, truth had a texture that manufacture didn't. People felt the difference. Even when they couldn't name it, his father had known that, in a garage in Atlanta in September, with a shop rag and a set of keys and a man who didn't deserve courtesy. "Drive safe now, sir." James put the newspaper on the desk and looked at it for a moment without picking it up. Then he got dressed. The Harrington Hotel Grand Ballroom, 6:52 p.m. The Grand Ballroom of the Harrington Hotel had been designed to make people feel the weight of occasion. Crystal chandeliers, 12 of them, throwing warm amber light across marble columns, and a floor that had been polished to a reflective sheen. 400 chairs in precise rows, facing an elevated stage. A podium at the center of the stage with the Westbridge International logo embossed in gold. A detail that managed to be both tasteful and unmistakable in its declaration of whose room this was. Frank Mercer had arrived at 6:15, 45 minutes before the doors opened to guests. He'd walked the room with his communications director, checked the sight lines from the podium, reviewed the positioning of the financial press along the side walls, confirmed the camera angles with the AV team. He'd done this at every annual gala for 19 years. He knew this room the way a conductor knows a hall. Not just the physical space, but its acoustics, the way sound moved in it, the way a room full of 400 particular people responded to particular things. He was ready. At 6:50, he stood near the stage with his notes. Dark suit, the good one, silver tie. The composed, authoritative bearing of someone who had prepared and knew it. The speech was precise. It didn't mention James Whitfield by name. That would have been too direct, too easily characterized as personal. Instead, it spoke about leadership stability in moments of institutional stress, about the responsibilities of ownership and the distinction between ownership and governance, about the protection of shareholder value in circumstances where emotional factors were being allowed to influence strategic decisions. Every person in that room would understand what he was describing. The beauty of careful language was that it let you say everything while technically saying nothing. Deanna Harlow arrived at 6:40, through a side entrance alone. She had spent the previous day the way Frank had told her to spend it, unavailable, unreachable, except to him, working from her apartment, waiting for the situation to resolve in the direction he had promised. She'd taken his calls. She'd followed the counter-narrative as it moved through the financial press. She'd done everything that 18 years of working within Frank's system had taught her to do when a situation needed managing. She had also spent the previous day with Rosa Vega's 12 words. Somewhere she couldn't relocate them to the periphery. She'd tried. The words kept returning to the center of her attention with the persistence of things that are true, which is the most stubborn kind of persistence there is. She found her seat in the third row, checked her phone once, put it in her bag. She had decided, sometime in the previous 24 hours, that she was going to be present tonight. Not because Frank had asked her to. He hadn't, specifically, but because running felt like something she would not be able to come back from. And she was not yet ready to commit to not coming back. She looked at the door. She was not certain what she hoped would come through it. The room filled at 7. The particular social choreography of corporate events, the cocktail hour clusters, the careful gravitational pull of people toward other people they needed to be seen with, the financial press along the walls, doing what financial press always did, which was watch and wait and make notes. At 7:03, the communications director signaled Frank. Frank moved toward the stage. The room began to settle, and then the main door opened. The Harrington Hotel, Grand Ballroom, 7:08 p.m., not dramatically, not with any sound or announcement. The door opened the way doors open when someone walks through them without requiring the room to notice. And the room noticed anyway, because the quality of the attention James Whitfield brought into spaces was not the kind that needed announcement. He came in first, flannel shirt. The blue one, same shade as the day before, because he hadn't thought about his clothes in 48 hours and wasn't going to start now. Canvas bag over his left shoulder, worn at the right bottom corner. The same man who had sat in the plastic chair at gate C14 with the vending machine coffee and the newspaper. Exactly the same man. That was the point. Delphine was on his left. Briefcase, reading glasses already in place. The expression of a woman who had spent 17 years being the most prepared person in any room she entered, and had never found a room that challenged that position. Warren Lyle was on his right. Dark jacket, no tie, The sealed drive case under his arm, carried with the specific attention of someone who knows exactly what they're holding and what it cost to get it here. Rosa Vega came next, not in uniform. A dark blue dress, simple, good fabric, small silver earrings. She walked with a particular dignity of someone who has been told, recently and explicitly, that they don't belong somewhere, and who has decided that the response to that information is to show up anyway. 14 years of professional composure had given her a specific quality of presence. Not loud, not aggressive, simply immovable. And then Simone Garrett, gray blazer, dark pants. The pearl earrings that James had noticed the morning before and still believed had belonged to someone she loved. She walked with the practiced discipline of someone who had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space. Not contracting, not expanding, just the right amount. Precisely calibrated, head straight, shoulders back. The room shifted, not dramatically, not all at once. But it shifted the way rooms shift when the thing that was supposed to be predictable turns out not to be. Conversations paused. Heads turned from the stage toward the door. The financial press along the walls straightened and reached for notebooks and phones. Frank Mercer looked up from his position near the podium. His face did not change. Something behind it did. Deanna Harlow saw James from across the room. The specific flicker that moved across her face in that moment was not fear and not guilt and not remorse. It was closer to the expression of someone who has been running a very careful calculation and has just discovered that a variable they'd accounted for doesn't match what's actually in front of them. She looked at Simone Garrett, looked back at James, put her phone face down on her knee. Frank recovered with the smoothness of 19 years. He moved to the podium with the unhurried confidence of someone who believes the room belongs to him and intends to act accordingly. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could begin to take our seats. Frank, James's voice, not raised, not projected, simply present. The particular quality of a voice that doesn't need volume because it has something else, something that makes the room lean in rather than requiring the room to be pushed. The ballroom went quiet. I'd like 5 minutes before we proceed. Frank kept his hands on the podium. Kept the smile, the practiced, executive smile that communicated warmth and authority simultaneously. A smile that had been refined over decades of these evenings, Mr. Whitfield. Tonight's program has a specific structure. As majority shareholder, I have the right to address this group before any vote or proceeding takes place. That's in the bylaws. Article 7, Section 3. I've read them, a beat, twice. A board member in the third row stood up. Eleanor Marsh. 68 years old, 30 years in corporate governance. The kind of woman who had sat in enough rooms to know exactly when one was about to go a direction that hadn't been announced on the agenda. She had a specific look she gave to those moments. She was giving it now. He's correct, Eleanor said. Flat, not a suggestion. A statement of fact delivered by someone who didn't particularly care whether it was convenient. Frank looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back. The look that passed between them had history in it. The history of someone who had seen Frank Mercer manage rooms for 19 years and had always understood precisely what he was doing. 5 minutes, Frank said. He stepped back from the podium. James walked to the stage. He didn't take the podium, stood beside it. The distinction was small and visible and deliberate. The podium said, I am speaking from authority. And standing beside it said, I don't need the prop. Thank you, he said. He looked at the room. 400 people, financial press along the walls, cameras in the corners, board members in the front rows. The particular assembly of people that Frank had spent years cultivating, because they were the people who mattered for the specific outcomes Frank needed. Most of you have seen the video from the day before yesterday. Or you've been briefed on it. Or someone sent it to you with a note about optics and brand exposure and what it means for the quarterly. He paused. That's not what I'm here to discuss, he nodded to Warren. The screens on either side of the stage, positioned for the usual shareholder presentation, for the charts and the projections and the year-in-review slides, lit up white, and then showed the cabin of Flight 1784. The Harrington Hotel, Grand Ballroom, 7:14 p.m. The footage played without introduction, no narration, no framing, no title card. Just the image, clean, clear. The forward cabin of a first-class section on an early morning flight. James in seat 4A, newspaper on his knee, coffee in hand, waiting. The ordinary patience of someone who has learned to wait without performance. Diana Harlow coming down the aisle. The 2 seconds. The room watched those 2 seconds. They were just 2 seconds of a woman looking at a man in a seat. Nothing physically dramatic in them. But the ballroom was very quiet, and, in that quiet, the 2 seconds held something that was visible even through a phone camera, the specific quality of a decision being made, without awareness that a decision was being made. The calculation running below the surface of the composed professional woman in the structured navy dress. Then her voice, no, absolutely not. The ballroom heard it the way you hear something you've been told about and then encounter directly. With the additional weight of confirmation, Rosa in the aisle. The boarding pass check. The confirmation. Diana's voice building, each sentence adding to the one before it. Someone like him doesn't belong up here. I paid for this seat. There has clearly been some kind of error. And then the hand, the extended finger. 3 inches from James Whitfield's face. The ballroom went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of attention. This was the quiet of 400 people absorbing something they couldn't pretend they hadn't seen. Then the screen shifted audio now, the ambient sound of a busy baggage claim, and then a voice, Diana's voice, followed by Frank Mercer's. Both clear, both audible, both transcribable. Handle Simone. Make sure she understands the risk of moving forward. Frank's response. Measured. The voice of a man for whom this kind of instruction was routine. I'll take care of it. The audio ended. The room stayed quiet. Warren moved to the next slide. Documents now. The Frank Mercer memo. 12 years old, his signature at the bottom. The bureaucratic language that described a system for making discrimination complaints disappear. The document was projected large enough to read from the back of the room. People in the front rows leaned forward. People in the back rows did the same. Then the statistical analysis. 34 terminations in 4 years under Diana Harlow's supervision. 26 of the 34. The numbers presented plainly, without emphasis, because the emphasis was already in the numbers themselves, and adding language to it would only dilute it. Eleanor Marsh was looking at Frank Mercer, not with the corporate governance expression. Something older than that. The expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time and has just been given the confirmation they didn't want to have because having it changes what they're required to do. Frank moved. He had to. Staying still was no longer an option. These documents are being presented selectively, without context. Mr. Mercer, Eleanor's voice. The same flat, factual quality she'd used from her seat a few minutes earlier. Sit down. He didn't sit. But he stopped moving. And in the gap between not sitting and not moving, something in the room shifted again, this time more permanently. James looked at the 400 people looking back at him. I'm going to ask someone else to speak now, he said. I want to ask one thing of everyone in this room while she does. A pause. Listen. He stepped back from the stage, and Simone Garrett walked forward. She didn't have notes. She'd been carrying what she was about to say for 3 years. Every word of it, every date, every specific detail of what it had felt like to be inside the system that the documents on the screen had described. She didn't need notes for things that had been living inside her since the day she stood on a sidewalk in November with a cardboard box in her arms and her badge already deactivated in her pocket. She stood at the front of the stage and looked at the room. 400 people, cameras, the financial press, who had come expecting a quarterly update and a leadership announcement and had gotten something entirely different. Board members who had spent the last 48 hours receiving calls from Frank Mercer, describing the situation in specific terms, and who were now looking at the situation directly for the first time. She'd never spoken to a room like this. 11 years at Westbridge, and she'd presented in regional meetings, in department reviews, in client calls with 3 or 4 people on a video conference. Never this. She thought about the bus route, same route every day. Because people are counting on you to show up. She started talking. 4 minutes. That was all she took. She didn't try to cover everything. The full 11 years. Every memo, every HR non-response, every day in the basement room. She found the shape of it, the arc that carried what it needed to carry. 11 years. 7 years of reviews that said exceptional. The nomination. 2 seconds. In Diana's office, where the phrase cultural fit was used to describe something it wasn't allowed to name directly. The complaint that disappeared, the project reassigned without notice. The basement room with a light that flickered in the left corner, irregularly, never enough to report, always enough to notice. The HVAC system that chose randomly between too cold and nothing. The mail cart every 40 minutes. I sat there for 4 months, she said, and I kept doing good work. I submitted every report on time. I met every deadline. I did everything I'd always done. Because I still believed, I genuinely believed, that eventually the numbers would matter more than whatever else was happening. She paused. The room was so quiet that the sound system carried the pause itself. They had packed my box the night before I was called in. Everything from my workspace, my desk photographs, my coffee mug, a small framed print I'd kept on my desk since my first year, in a cardboard box with a lid, sitting on the table when I walked through the door. The night before, which means the meeting was decided before I sat down, which means every performance review that had been updated, every complaint that had been rerouted, every day in that basement room. All of it had been building toward an outcome that was chosen before the process it was supposed to justify even began. I just didn't know yet that I was already at the end. She looked at the room, not at Frank, not at Diana. At the 400 people who were looking back at her. My mother is 72 years old. She drove 14 hours to come stay with me after I lost this job. Not because I asked. Because I needed the help and couldn't make myself ask. She has been with me for 2 years now. Every morning she makes coffee before I'm awake. She brings it to me before I get up, and every morning when I take that cup from her, I think about what it cost her to do that. Not the gas, not the time. What it costs a 72-year-old woman to watch her daughter start over. At 41 years old, with 11 years of outstanding performance, in a box under her bed. Because the system that was supposed to protect her chose instead to protect the people who were hurting her. She stopped, looked down. One breath. I'm not here because I want this room to feel sorry. I'm here because somewhere in this company right now, today, this week, there is someone sitting in a basement office with a light that nobody fixed. Someone who filed a complaint that disappeared into a case number and a form email. Someone who has learned, very carefully and very professionally, that the cost of telling the truth inside this institution is higher than the cost of silence. I'm here so that person knows it doesn't have to stay that way. She stepped back. The room did not immediately applaud. It sat with it first, the way you sit with something that has actual weight, not performing the absorption of it, but actually absorbing it. The difference was visible in the room, in the quality of the stillness, in the faces of people who had arrived tonight expecting a specific evening, and were now in a different one. Then Eleanor Marsh stood up slowly, with the deliberateness of someone for whom standing was a statement, rather than a reflex, and she began to clap, not fast, not performatively. The steady, deliberate applause of someone who means it, who has decided, in this moment, that meaning it matters more than what it costs. One by one, the board member beside her, then another, then people in the rows behind, then a cascade, people rising. The sound building from steady individual beats into something that filled the ballroom. not everyone. Frank remained in his chair. Diana had not moved. A handful of others stayed seated, for their own reasons. But the room stood, and in the specific physics of rooms and power, that meant something. Frank tried once more. The claims being made here tonight are legally unsubstantiated. Frank, Eleanor, still standing. I said, sit down. He sat. The Harrington Hotel, grand ballroom and aftermath. 7:47 p.m. into night, the federal investigators entered through the main entrance. At 7:47 p.m., 3 of them, dark suits. The specific walk of people who are not in a hurry because they don't need to be, the walk of a process already in motion, arriving at its next step. This was not an ambush. It was not improvised. It was the result of a formal complaint filed with the Department of Labor and the Securities and Exchange Commission 3 days earlier, submitted by Delphine Hurst with the full documentary package, the memo, the statistical analysis, the evidence chain for the audio and video files, and the documented pattern of complaint suppression across multiple years and multiple employees. The investigators had spent 3 days reviewing the materials. They had coordinating conversations with Delphine's office. They had questions for Frank Mercer, and they had timed their arrival because Delphine had told them where he would be. And when Frank saw them coming from across the room, and the thing that moved across his face in that moment was not fear exactly, something older. The expression of someone who has spent 19 years managing situations and has just understood, for the first time, that this particular situation had been managing him. That while he was running containment, the thing he was trying to contain had already gotten out. The lead investigator stopped in front of him. Mr. Mercer, we'd like you to come with us. Frank stood. He walked. The room parted for him the way rooms part for something that has become unavoidable, not with ceremony, not with drama, just with the silent instinctive adjustment of people making space for something they cannot stop. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. Diana Harlow was in the 3rd row. She had been sitting there since Simone began speaking. She had not moved, had not looked at her phone, had not shifted or adjusted or attempted to leave. She had simply sat and listened and looked at her hands, and occasionally at the stage, and then at her hands again. After the investigators escorted Frank out, the room began to breathe again in the specific way. Rooms breathe after the held breath releases, the exhale of people who have been tense for longer than they realized and are only now, with the immediate thing resolved, feeling the tension drain. Board members moved toward each other with the urgent purposefulness of people who needed to decide things. The financial press clustered near the exits, already filing. Warren was fielding questions from Eleanor Marsh with the patient press of someone who had prepared for exactly this. Diana sat in the 3rd row, in a room full of people, all of whom had stopped looking at her. Not as a coordinated statement, not deliberately. They had simply stopped, the way attention withdraws from something that is no longer the center of anything. The people who had spent 18 years orienting themselves relative to Diana Harlow's position, calibrating their behavior, reading her signals, managing her reactions, had oriented themselves elsewhere, toward Eleanor, toward Warren, toward the investigators, toward each other. She had been the center of things for 18 years. She hadn't known, until this moment, what it felt like for that to simply stop. James moved through the room. Brief exchange with Eleanor, a nod, a few words, the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had done what needed doing and didn't need it celebrated. A hand placed briefly on Warren's shoulder. He stopped beside Simone and put his hand on her shoulder for a moment. Just a moment, just enough. And she nodded without speaking, which said everything. He was almost at the door. He stopped, turned, walked back through the room, past the clusters of conversation, past the financial press, to the 3rd row. He stood beside Diana Harlow's chair. She looked up. The first time she'd looked directly at him since the Isle of Flight on 1184. And the thing in her eyes was not the calculation that had been there at the baggage carousel, and not the entitlement that had been there in the cabin, and not the composure she'd arrived with tonight. Something stripped of all of those. Something underneath all of them that had been there all along. James didn't say anything about what was coming for her. He didn't say anything about justice or accountability or what the investigators would find. He didn't offer comfort and he didn't offer condemnation. He said, "I hope you find something worth living for. Something that isn't built on what you lost tonight." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked away. Deanna watched him go. She sat with what he'd said. Not because it comforted her. It didn't. Not because it absolved her. It didn't do that either. It stayed with her because it was something entirely different from both of those things. It was the truth, offered plainly, without cruelty and without softness. The kind of sentence that doesn't give you anywhere to put your reaction because it isn't an attack, and it isn't a pardon, and it isn't designed to make you feel any particular way. It just is. And sitting with something that just is. When you're used to a world where everything is leverage, and everything is framing, and everything means something strategic, that was harder than anything else that had happened tonight. Rosa Vega found her own way out of the ballroom at 8:30, after speaking briefly with Warren, and then with Delphine, who had specific questions about the timeline of the suspension notice and what Rosa's own documentation of the flight looked like. They stood near the side wall for 20 minutes, Delphine's pen moving steadily. Rosa's voice steady and precise, in the way that 14 years of professional composure makes a voice precise under pressure. When she left the hotel, she stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment. Cold night. Clear. The city running its usual program around her. She thought about what she'd said to Diana Harlow in the aisle of Flight 11184. The 12 words. She'd said them without planning to say them. They'd arrived in the moment, from something true, and she'd said them, and then walked away. She still believed them. She got in a cab and went home. Tantra, Manhattan, Hotel Room 714. Later, that night, James got back to the hotel at 10:15. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark, not turning on the lamp. Room 714. Same brick wall outside the window. The city humming its usual program. He hadn't changed his shirt. After a while, he called Delphine. She picked up on the second ring. The board? Eleanor convened an emergency session at 9. They'll be meeting until at least 2 a.m., James. The votes are there. It's done. He nodded at the window. She couldn't see it, and Simone? She's with her mother tonight. She called me from the car. A pause. She asked me to tell you something. What? She said. The bus ran on time. James looked at the brick wall outside the window, at the space where Manhattan was just out of frame, glittering the way it always did, completely indifferent to what had happened in any one room. Night. The same city it had been yesterday and the day before, and would be tomorrow, running on its own enormous schedule regardless. Good, he said. Get some sleep. We have months of work starting tomorrow. I know. James. Yes, what you said to her, Diana. At the end, a pause. I heard it from across the room. He was quiet, your father, Delphine said. Not a question. Not really. Probably, James said. He hung up, sat in the dark for a while longer. Then he reached over and picked up the newspaper from the nightstand. The one from yesterday morning, still folded. He hadn't finished it. He'd gotten through most of it, but the back section was still unread. He turned on the lamp, found his place, right until midnight. 2 weeks later. Westbridge International, and Beyond the Statement came out on a Thursday. Westbridge International had retained independent counsel to conduct a full audit of employment practices in the operations division going back 15 years. The audit was to be conducted by a firm with no prior relationship to the company. Its findings would be reported directly to the board. Diana Harlow's employment was terminated, effective immediately. All unvested equity, benefits continuation, and severance provisions revoked pursuant to the conduct clauses in her employment agreement. A civil investigation was underway. The company was cooperating fully. Frank Mercer had resigned the previous week, pending the federal investigation into labor law violations, financial misconduct in the management of discrimination settlements, and conspiracy to obstruct internal complaint processes. Outside counsel had confirmed cooperation with investigators. Rosa Vega was reinstated with full back pay from the date of suspension. A formal apology was entered into the company record. Not a press release, not a statement attributed to a communications department, but a document in her personnel file acknowledging that the suspension had been retaliatory, improper, and without merit, and a new position was created. Director of Passenger Ethics and Employee Advocacy, reporting directly to the board rather than through the airline's internal management chain. The role had a budget, a staff of 3, and actual authority to investigate and escalate complaints that the previous structure had been designed to absorb and lose. Rosa accepted. She asked, in her acceptance letter, that the role include a formal protocol for reviewing any suspension of frontline employees that occurred within 30 days of a reported passenger incident. The board approved it without revision. Simone Garrett was offered a position at Westbridge, not her old position, something that hadn't existed before. The Office of Employee Protection, independent of HR with a direct reporting line to the board, staffed to investigate complaints that the previous internal processes had been structured to suppress. Her title was Director. Her mandate was specific. Ensure that no complaint filed within Westbridge was ever again routed to the people it was a complaint about. She accepted, not because she had forgiven the company. Forgiveness was a separate project, one she was working on privately at her own pace, without a timeline imposed by anyone else. She accepted because somewhere in that building right now, today, there was a person in a workspace with a flickering light. A person who had filed a complaint that had disappeared into a case number. A person who had been carefully, professionally taught that the cost of truth was higher than the cost of silence. She intended to fix that light. And then the next one, and then the one after that, because her father drove the same route for 31 years, and she was his daughter. A compensation review was announced for all employees, terminated under the previous leadership structure. Going back 12 years, the full span of the system Frank had built, independent auditors, not Westbridge's usual firm. A process that would take months, because these processes always took months, and announcing a timeline that suggested otherwise would have been a lie. That was the honest part. Not everything resolves in 2 weeks. Not everything broken gets fixed in the same season it broke. Some things take time, the legal processes, the appeals, the individual assessments, the paperwork that has to exist before money moves and records change, and the official version of what happened to someone matches what actually happened. Some of it takes a person who decides, at 4 in the morning, with the city shifting outside the window, that they're going to make the call. Drive the route. Show up especially when the world isn't cooperating, especially then. Port Ornang, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, Gate C-14. 3 weeks after the flight 6:47 a.m., the same gate, the same plastic chairs, the same vending machine in the same position against the same wall, dispensing the same coffee that was always too hot and always tasted like it, had been waiting too long for someone to choose it. James Whitfield sat in the corner chair. Canvas bag on the floor beside him, worn at the right bottom corner, flannel shirt, blue, different shirt, same kind, the kind his father had worn to work every morning of his working life. Newspaper on his knee, open to the front page. The gate was filling in the way. Gate C-14 filled in, the early morning. The young mother again, or someone like her, negotiating the stroller with one hand. The businessmen with the matching luggage. The teenager asleep across 3 chairs like airports were designed to be slept in. Normal morning, normal people, normal noise. James read the paper. At 7:12, a man sat down beside him, mid-60s. Well-dressed, the kind of suit that had been chosen rather than grabbed that communicated membership in a specific category of professional life. He settled in, checked his phone, looked around the gate area. Then he looked at James. And looked again, the second look. The one that comes after recognition. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, with the specific awkwardness of someone who knows they're intruding and has decided to intrude anyway, because the thing they want to say seems worth the intrusion. "But you're James Whitfield." James looked up from the paper. "I am. The man gestured vaguely at the space around them. The plastic chair, the vending machine coffee in James's hand. The complete absence of anything in the gate area that suggested a person with 68% of a Fortune 500 company. "I have better seats down that way. More space." "I'd be glad to." James looked at the man, at the genuine discomfort in his face. The awkward kindness of someone trying, in the only way immediately available to them, to gesture towards something better. To make some small account for something that had happened to a stranger. To offer what was offerable. He shook his head. "Sit down," James said. "We're going the same direction." The man sat. He looked at his phone, put it in his pocket. Looked at James again with the expression of someone who has more to say and isn't sure they should say it. "My wife," he said finally. "She watched everything, all the coverage. She said," she cried 3 times. James smiled. Not the polite kind, not the public kind. The small, real kind. The kind that has been living somewhere quiet for a while and has decided that this, precisely this, is a reasonable moment for it to arrive. "Tell her thank you," he said, and went back to the weather section. Portland, rain through Thursday. Milwaukee, clear. Chicago, partly cloudy, front coming in from the lake. He read all of it, the gate filled around him. The boarding announcement came at 7:58. The line formed with the usual organized night chaos of people and luggage and the specific social calculus of who stands where and when. James folded the newspaper, tucked it under his arm, picked up his canvas bag, walked to the gate, got on the plane, in his seat 4A, window. The same assignment he'd booked 3 weeks ago on a different flight because he'd learned long ago that the details are where the truth lives, and he intended to keep living in them. He put his bag under the seat, not in the overhead bin, and unfolded the newspaper to where he'd left off. The man from the gate took the aisle seat in the same row. He buckled his seatbelt, looked at James, looked at the newspaper, seemed on the verge of saying something else and decided against it. They sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people going the same direction, who don't need to fill the air between them. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engines built. Dallas fell away below, and James Whitfield read the paper. Every section, every page. The weather for cities he'd never visit, the way his father had read it. Every Sunday morning, at a kitchen table in southwest Atlanta, because the world was bigger than what you could see from your own window. And a man who only knew his own weather didn't know much at all. His father had told him that. He'd been carrying it for 46 years. He intended to carry it for 46 more.